An overview of Slavic gods, translation of a fragment of a chapter Slavic deities from Religion of Pagan Slavs by Stanisław Ułbańczyk. Sverog Dajbog. Svarogits is mentioned primarily in West Slavic sources. First, Saint Bruno reproaches Emperor Henry in a letter for allying himself with Svarogits against the Christian Bolesław the Brave, referring to the joint expeditions of the Germans and Veleti against Poland. However, we learn nothing from him except the bare name of the deity. A few years later, however, the chronicler Thietmer informed us that in Radagosts, the stronghold of the Radarians, there was a temple where pagans kept images of gods, among which Svarogits occupied the first place. However, the chronicler was so absorbed in describing the temple, its location, and the divinations performed there that he told us nothing about the god himself. So we do not know what he was the god of, what his statue looked like, what sacrifices were made to him, etc. Adam of Bremen mentioned him several decades later, but instead of providing an explanation, he only increased our confusion, because he called the god who certainly ruled in the same stronghold Radagosts. Could he have meant another god, one of the lesser ones mentioned by Thietmer? No one thinks so. Bruckner passionately maintained that Adam knew nothing more than what he had read in Thietmer, but misunderstood his words, turning the name of the land of the Radarians into the name of the stronghold Ritra, and the name of the stronghold into the name of the god. However, Bruckner failed to gain acceptance for his thesis, and in addition, in more recent times, source criticism values Adam more highly than Bruckner, and the view has been established that Adam did not read Thietmer, so his information cannot be dismissed as second-hand. Perhaps the best solution would be to accept the following compromise. Radagosts is indeed the name of the stronghold where the temple stood, but it comes from the name Radagost, which may have been the second name or nickname of Svarog, as the protector of guests. The name Radagosts from its form means the settlement of Radagost, and since Thietmer says that there was nothing there but a temple, the name Radagosts could mean a settlement place of worship of the god Radagost. Unfortunately, no absolute proof can be provided. We also encounter Svarogits in Russian sources, Slovo Kristolubca, Saint Gregory and John Chrysostom, which are quite late 14th century, but probably draw on earlier records or contemporary ethnographic facts. This is the only case where the same deity is mentioned in both the Eastern and Western Slavic regions. The Russians add an important detail, namely that, according to them, Svarogits was the name of the revered fire, especially important in a very cold, sunless climate for the economically important fire in the grain dryer. Therefore, it may not be a great sin against scientific accuracy to consider the Radagosts Svarogits a god of fire. The name Svarogits could mean son of Svarog, just as Polish Voivodzic means son of a voivode and Królewicz means son of a king. It could also be an affectionate name for Svarog himself. However, the latter function of the suffix "ike" is less common, so the former interpretation should be accepted. This opens up completely unexpected perspectives. Namely, one Russian source, the so-called Malalas, actually a translation of the work of the Greek writer Malalas, also excerpted by the chronicles, says that the god Svarog had a son, Dajbog, who was the ruler of the sun, or the sun itself. What makes the whole matter even more interesting is the fact that for Malala's translator, these were Egyptian deities. In the Greek original of this text, Dajbog corresponds to Helios and Svarog to Hephaestus. After the death of Hephaestus, whom they also call Svarog, his son named Sun in Greek. Helios, whom they call Dajbog, ruled over the Egyptians. The emperor of the sun, son of Svarog in Greek. Hephaestus, that is Dajbog, was a stern man. The words highlighted in separate print are not found in the Greek original, but were inserted by the Russian translator. As a result, a very difficult question arises as to whether it is permissible to consider these deities real at all, whether it is permissible to consider Dajbog the sun god, as in Nidrel, whether he can be identified with Svarogits as the son of Svarog, or whether, as some prefer, Svarogits is to be identical with Svarog. Much depends on the assessment of the source itself. According to some Istrin, it was created around 1250th, according to others, Shakhmatov, in the first half of the 12th century. Could pagan traditions still have been alive at that time? Since there is evidence that Malala's translation was made on the border between pagan Lithuania and Rus, the likelihood of the vitality of Rus paganism is high. Given the weakness of the Orthodox Church and the low level of education of the priests, paganism persisted throughout Rus for centuries, absorbing many Christian elements, so that one speaks of devoevry, a dual pagan-Christian faith. Therefore, someone familiar with local conditions and beliefs could accurately substitute Dashbog and Svarog for Helios and Hephaestus. However, no convincing evidence can be provided, so scholars are divided into two camps. Some consider Svarog and Dashbog to be the invention of Malala's translators, while others consider them to be relics of actual paganism. I myself am inclined to evaluate Malala's information positively, seeing in Svarog and Dashbog the names of the elements of the symbolic complex discussed above. Sky, thunder, sun, fire. I consider Dashbog to be identical to Svarog, and in any case, I consider Svarog to be the most reliable figure in the ancient Slavic Olympus, because he is the only one mentioned in both Russian and Pomeranian sources. Since Perun, who will be discussed below, is associated with thunder, Dashbog Svarogits with fire and the sun, his father Svarog would probably be the deified sky. However, I would like to emphasize that this is only a subjective opinion. From a scientific point of view, it would be almost equally justified to reject Malala's testimony. Attempts were also made to destroy the Russian Svarogits by presenting him as a deity brought to Rus by merchants arriving via the Baltic Sea from Pomerania. This was the opinion of the great scholar Jajic. However, there is also an opposite opinion that Svarog traveled from Rus to Pomerania by the same route. In my opinion, neither view is justified. However, I mention them to show how uncertain our ground is. We encounter no less difficulties with the etymology of these names. There are at least 5 different explanations for the name Svarog. In Poland, Bruckner's etymology from Swazic sea to quarrel is best known, according to which Svarog is a fire quarrelsome. Maszynski speaks briefly and concisely about this etymology, saying that it does not even deserve a mention. He himself would also derive it from Swazic sea, but in the sense of to be angry, because a certain inhabitant Polsy who, hearing thunder, said, Bo Svaroksa, that is God, is angry. So Svarog would be the god of the angry sky. However, he does not insist on this, admitting, following the example of earlier mythologists, that the name Svarog may be borrowed from some Aryan language, and that it would contain the root Svar, which we know from the Avestan language. War, light of the sky, sun, and from Sanskrit. Svar, splendor, sky, sun. Since the Slavs were at one time subject to Iranian religious influences, an older borrowing from Aryan would not be unusual. If we agreed to this, Svarog would mean god of the sky or sun, in accordance with what I have assumed above on other grounds. His alleged son Dashbog equals Svarogits can also boast several etymologies of his name. At first glance, it seems that it contains the Slavic roots. Durenbog, but it is not known what form of the verb the first part of the compound is supposed to be. The spelling dashed and dash used in Russian texts leads most scholars to assume that this is an old form of the imperative, which, according to the laws of Polish language development, should be daj. The second part of the compound can be understood in 2 ways. Either bog means God or it means wealth, happiness. This was the original meaning of the word, while the meaning God is younger and, as I said, imposed by the influence of some Iranian language. So together, Dashbog means giver of wealth or God-giver. Due to the similarity of the compound Dashbog in Polish Dadzbog, tn to such compounds as Voivodeb, Palivoda, Vazivoda, the interpretation giver of wealth would be more natural. However, there are other etymologies. They break with the word dak in Polish to give tn, referring, for example, to the root dag to burn, which would not be impossible in the name of a sun deity, while some go beyond Slavic vocabulary. As usual, it is impossible to decide, but I prefer to stick with the simpler etymology based on Slavic elements, that is Dashbog, giver of wealth. Svarogits is mentioned, as I said, both in Rus and in the West, and scholars also refer to place names such as Svarogin and Svaroshivo as evidence of the cult of Svarog in Poland. Dashbog is mentioned outside Malala's in Nestor's chronicle, but nowhere outside Rus is he named by name. Therefore, Bruckner, wanting to substantiate the existence of his cult among Poles, referred to the use of the name Dashbog among the Mazovian nobility in the 15th century. In my opinion, such references to place names and personal names are not very justified. They do testify to the occurrence of the word in a certain area, but this does not in itself mean that the word was the name of a worshipped being. The existence of the cult is made more likely by the existence of the words, but we do not know the cult's extent, let alone its certainty. Similarly, I do not attach much importance to Daboga, the ruler of the earth who fought against God, the Lord of Heaven, mentioned in Serbian songs. The whole myth has non-Slavic features, and its authenticity has not been verified. Since I consider Dashbog to be identical with Svarog, recognizing the universality of the cult of Svarog, I naturally recognize Dashbog, but I am not sure whether the name Dashbog was in common use. Probably yes. Finally, it should be added that all the details that can be found anywhere about his appearance and functions as a god are the invention of reckless mythologists. Perun. He is known exclusively from Russian sources. The princes of Rus and their people swore by him when concluding treaties with the Greeks in the 10th century. Vladimir the Great, upon coming to power, revived his cult and that of other gods, erected a shrine to him in Kiev, and Vladimir's uncle erected a statue in Novgorod. No one questioned the reliability of the sources and the reality of this god, but there are some serious problems. First of all, his relationship to Thor, the Scandinavian god of thunder and lightning, is unclear. Some claim that Perun is only an echo of Thor, and therefore a Russian innovation, not a Proto-Slavic god. The fact is that the princes who swore by him were from the Varangian dynasty, and that the ceremonies resemble Germanic practices, laying down weapons, special curses for breaking an oath. Moreover, we have no evidence outside of Rus that a deity of this name was known. The cult of the god of thunder is attested, as we already know, by Procopius, but he does not mention the name, and moreover, we do not know whether he was the god of the sky and thunder at the same time, like Jupiter or Zeus. It therefore seems that the extent of the cult of Perun was closely linked to the extent of the political influence of the Varangians. A wider knowledge of Perun was defended by the occurrence of the word Perun as a common word or place name in various Slavic countries, especially in Poland, in Polish Piorun, but this alone cannot prove that there was a cult of a god of that name in Poland. On the contrary, it could be argued that since it is a common word in Poland, it could not have been the name of a god. Sacred words are protected from profanation and cannot be overused. They are subject to a so-called linguistic taboo. Because they are rarely used, they are easily lost. This is supposedly how the old name for bear in the Proto-Slavic language, corresponding to the Greek arctos, was lost and replaced by a new one. Nijvij, formerly Mijvij, that is honey-eater, and thus originally a substitute name, of which there are many in the language of hunters, compare dandy, shooter for a deer, gobbler for turkey. So in my opinion, while there is really no evidence for the cult of Perun in Poland, his cult in the Balkans can be defended. There, Saint Elijah is worshipped as the patron saint of storms and the thunderer, Gromovic in Serbian, and in various countries, some Christian saints took over the functions previously performed by pagan deities. Perhaps, in defense of the cult of Perun, one may cite traces of worship of thunder throughout the Slavic world, but these manifestations of fearful worship could just as well have referred to the god of the sky, who is also the god of thunder. As we can see, all arguments are shaky. Each of them can be refuted with good reason, so in the end it again depends on the goodwill and faith of the scholar to take a position between two extremes. Recognizing Perun as a Germanic import, limited to Rus, or as the god of the entire Slavic world. Bruckner, for example, rejected the evidence from the cult of Saint Elijah, but on the basis of local names, he agreed to recognize Perun as a universal god. I, on the other hand, see no reason for such an extension of the cult, although, on the other hand, I cannot fully agree with the theory of Perun's Varangian origin. He could have been a local Russian god of native origin, the personification of the element described above. The sky with thunder as one of its attributes. Outside Rus, throwing thunderbolts could have been the privilege of Svarog, and this aspect of divine power did not have to be personified in a separate god. Zeus was such a god of the sky and thunder who was not separated. In other words, Perun may simply be the local name for one of Svarog's attributes. Explaining the name poses great difficulties. As long as we do not go beyond the Slavic world, the etymology is seemingly easy. We divide the word peron into the root per, the same as in the verb pure/prats to wash, Proto-Slavic pira, and the suffix un, as in begun, execute, vistan, and a few others. Peron, therefore, is the one who strikes, hits, as even today peasants say that something struck somewhere. Peron, or pioron in Polish phonetic form, is the personified cause of the strike. However, when we go beyond the Slavic border, the matter becomes more complicated. Namely, the god of thunder among our neighbors, the Lithuanians, who are very closely related to us Poles, linguistically, was called perkunas, which derives from the ancient name for oak, best known in Latin as quercus. This perkunas again corresponds perfectly phonetically with the name of the mother of Thor, the god of storm and thunder, Firjin, whose older phonetic form was perkunya. Anyone with even a little knowledge of mythology knows that the oak tree was sacred to the gods of thunder, because thunderbolts strike oak trees particularly often. If we want to maintain the ancient connection between Slavic, Lithuanian, and Baltic in general and Germanic mythology, which is very tempting for many reasons, there was a special kinship between these languages in the distant past, we must say goodbye to our clear etymology from Prats. Bruckner chose this difficult path, saying that from the Proto-Slavic perkin, as it would theoretically have to be in Slavic, a name consistent with Lithuanian but already incomprehensible to the people, first came Perin, partially assimilated to the Proto-Slavic pira I wash, and then Peron. Traces of the form Perin exist in Rus. However, Mansica, a serious scholar, sees in this instability of the suffix, because there is also the form Persian proof that the Slavs borrowed this name, because such fluctuations occur in borrowings until one of the variant forms finally becomes established. In my opinion, Bruckner's etymology is acceptable, as we know of more complicated etymologies. In this way, the god of the oak tree, Debovik Oakley, Tn, as Bruckner says, could have become the god of thunder. By accepting this etymology, we preserve the eternity and native character, limited to Rus, and perhaps the Balkans, of this deity, and we can only admit that the Germanic Thor had some influence on the ideas and practices associated with his cult, the oath ritual, and perhaps even contributed decisively to Peron's rise to prominence above other gods. This primacy was perhaps limited, as some scholars suppose, to the princely family of the Varangian dynasty. According to the so-called Nestor, Vladimir erected statues of several gods, including Peron, near his court in Kiev. And Vladimir began to reign alone in Kiev and erected idols on the hill outside the palace, a wooden Peron with a silver head and a golden mustache, and Chors and Dashbog and Stribog and Simargl and Makash, and he made sacrifices to the idols with his people. This passage is repeated in later sources, which sometimes omit something or insert a new name. There are also major errors in the rewrites. For example, the two Russian words Zilats, that is Peron's golden mustache, were once turned into a new deity, Uswad. Another time, the name Simargwa is split into two, Sim and Arju, which will be discussed below. Here, I would like to point out one thing. Based on the quoted excerpt, one could easily formulate a thesis about the greatness of the Kiev's Peron. However, there is really no basis for this. The sentence mentioning the gods was included in the text of the chronicle because it was reworked at the very end of the 11th century. It is highly likely that the writer may have heard the names of the gods circulating among the semi-pagan people, but it is unlikely that after 100 years the appearance of the statue would still be remembered. Indeed, a place that served as a model for the writer has been found. Namely, in another part of the same chronicle, it is said of the Eastern pagans in ancient times that they began to erect idols, some wooden, others marble, and still others gold or silver. It is therefore reasonable to assume that the description of the statue is merely a display of the author's erudition and stylistic skill, and does not reflect reality. In mythology, there is a claim that Peron held a thunderbolt in his hand, but this is based on a late source from the 16th century, when nothing was known about paganism, and people were eager to embellish old chronicle information with their own fantasies. A more reliable, though still uncertain, source states that the Peron of Novgorod, erected by Vladimir's uncle Dobrynya, held a wooden club in his hand. Both statues met a sad fate. The chronicle tells of the one in Kiev. When he arrived the baptized Vladimir in Kiev, he ordered the statues to be torn down, some to be chopped into pieces, others to be thrown into the fire, but he ordered Perun to be tied to a horse's tail and dragged from the hill along Borishev's slope to the river, and he gave 12 men to beat him with sticks. As they dragged it along the river to the Dnieper, the unbelievers wept over it, for they had not yet been baptized. And when they had dragged it there, they threw it into the Dnieper. And Vladimir commanded, saying, "If he stops anywhere, you must push him away from the shore until he passes through the rapids, then you must leave him." So they carried out his orders. And when they left him, he crossed the rapids, and the wind threw him onto a rock, and from that it took the name Perun's Rock, as it is still called today. In Novgorod, Archbishop Joachim took it upon himself to destroy pagan worship. He destroyed the sacrificial altars and ordered Perun to be dragged into the Pachina River, beating him with sticks. In the morning, a villager on his way to the market saw him on the shore. He pushed him away with a stick, saying, "You old Perun, you have drunk and eaten enough, now float away." What? For a scholarly discussion of Perun, including references, see L. Niederl, a Bruckner, V.J. Mansica. Vaos Veal. Vaos or Veals is often included among the general Slavic gods. He is mentioned alongside Perun because of the oath with which Rus confirmed its agreement with Constantinople. There he is called the god of cattle. Czech sources from the 15th and 16th centuries mention a demon named Veals. At that time it was written as Kai Veals or referred to as Kai Velesu, similar to how we would ask Kai Daibu Polish, literally which devil, meaning similar to what the hell, tn, or refer to someone as Du Diabła Polish, literally to the devil, meaning similar to go to hell, tn. Some mythologists identify this Veals with Vaos, and see this as proof of the widespread cult of this god. Bruckner also supports this identification, but he indignantly rejects the idea that Vaos could be the patron god of cattle. Instead, he claims that in the final era of paganism, Veals was mistakenly confused with Saint Vlas, Saint Blaise, the patron saint of cattle. This cult of Saint Blaise was supposed to have migrated through the Balkans and distorted the native concepts of the god Veals. Bruckner and Niederl before him links this name to the Lithuanian Velinas, devil, and considers Vaos to be the god of the underworld and the dead, which in turn could explain why people swore by him. It is known from Greco-Roman mythology that oaths made to the deities of the underworld were particularly sacred. A handful of earth was taken in the hand. It is interesting that when swearing, the Russians sprinkled their heads with crushed turf, which also involves earth. According to Helmold, the Slavs were very reluctant to swear as a matter of principle. From this point of view, Bruckner's arguments are interesting and appealing. Their weak point is that the Lithuanian facts themselves are uncertain and unclear, so they do not provide a good basis for the Slavic ones. As a result, Bruckner's view is worth noting, but it remains only a conjecture like many others. The view that there was no Slavic god named Vaos or Veals deserves separate discussion. In fact, there was only Saint Blaise or Vlas, the patron saint of cattle, whose cult, as I have already mentioned, spread from the Byzantine Greeks to the Balkan Slavs and then to the Rus, until finally, in the era of the conclusion of treaties with Byzantium in 971, he seemed to be a being equivalent to Perun. However, the chronicle did not mention him among Vladimir's gods, which, according to some scholars, is evidence that the writer did not consider him a god, that in a word, the writer was aware of his Christian origins. Some manuscripts of the chronicle even spell his name as Vwasij or Vwas, not Vaos, that is like a saint. The linguistic explanation of how the transition from Vlas to Vaos took place is neither difficult nor complicated, for experts, of course. In the Russian language, there were many examples of the same word having, on the one hand, the Old Church Slavonic ending wa, and on the other hand, the native phonetic development owo, for example, mwad and moad, so following their example, Vlas could have become Vaos. Opponents of Vaos' Christian origins will of course say that it was precisely the existence of these fluctuations between Va and Ovo that made it possible to confuse the ancient god Vaos with Saint Vlas. Such an assumption of the function of a god by a Christian saint is not unusual. A similar promotion befell Saint Nicholas among the Mari, Ugra and Samoyed people. Saint Blaise himself was called Skotski Bog, that is cattle god, by the people. People prayed to him for protection of their cattle, offered him sacrifices of butter and bread, and even slaughtered oxen, consuming part of them in a ritual feast, while the bones were buried in the stable amid prayers for a good harvest of cattle. The cult of Saint Blaise as the patron saint of cattle was known throughout Western Europe. Supporters of Saint Vlas consider the Czech Veals in the role of Volas to be a reworking of the biblical Baal or the Greek Belos in the modern Greek pronunciation Velos. It is impossible to decide between the views presented here. Discussion of Volas and detailed literature in El Nidral, a Bruckner and especially V. J. Mansica.